The burning tank destroyer sat like a wounded animal at the crossroads, its turret twisted skyward and black smoke pouring from the engine compartment. Staff Sergeant Audie Murphy crouched behind a shattered stone wall, watching the flames lick at the vehicle's steel flanks, while German voices echoed from the tree line 200 yards away. The January wind cut through the Vosgian mountains with surgical precision, turning his breath to white clouds and making his rifle stock slick with frozen condensation. 3 hours earlier, the tank destroyer had been their ace in the hole, a mobile fortress positioned to cover the main approach into the valley where the 3rd Infantry Division held a tenuous line against Wehrmacht counterattacks. Now it was a smoking monument to how quickly everything could go sideways in these snow-choked forests of eastern France. The crew had bailed out when a Panzerfaust round punched through the rear armor, but they'd left the main gun intact and a dozen rounds of high-explosive ammunition stacked beside the gunner's seat. "Sarge, we need to pull back to the secondary line," Private Kowalski whispered, his words barely audible over the crackling flames. "That thing's gonna cook off any minute, and when it does, every Kraut in the sector's gonna know exactly where we are." Murphy studied the tactical situation with the methodical patience his men had learned to respect. The resistance fighters' crude map had gotten them this far, but it hadn't warned them about the German armor that had appeared on the parallel ridge at dawn. Company headquarters was 3 miles behind them, connected by a single forest road that German observers now had under direct fire. The radio operator, Private Henderson, had been trying to raise battalion for the past hour, but static was all they got. Either the antenna had taken shrapnel or the relay station was down. The official orders were clear: hold the crossroads until relieved, deny the enemy access to the valley road, and protect the main force's eastern flank. Simple enough on paper. But papers didn't account for the tank destroyer burning like a beacon, or the fact that Murphy's squad of 12 men was now down to 8 effective soldiers. Corporal Williams still lay motionless beside the stone wall where a sniper's bullet had found him during the initial exchange of fire. "How much ammunition do we have left?" Murphy asked, though he already knew the answer wouldn't be encouraging. "Maybe 40 rounds per man for the M1s, Henderson replied without looking up from the radio. 2 clips left for the bar, and Private Rodriguez has 3 grenades. That's it." The sound of tracked vehicles grew louder from the German positions, metal grinding against frozen earth in a rhythm that every infantryman learned to fear. Murphy watched the smoke from the tank destroyer twist in the mountain wind, carrying the acrid smell of burning fuel and rubber across the battlefield. In a few minutes, the enemy would have armor support for their next probe. When that happened, his thin line of riflemen wouldn't be able to hold the crossroads for more than a few heartbeats. Yet something about the burning vehicle nagged at his tactical instincts. The main gun hadn't been damaged. He could see the barrel clearly through the smoke, still pointed toward the tree line where German infantry had been massing. The fire was contained to the engine compartment and rear of the vehicle. If a man could reach the gunner's position without getting killed by sniper fire, those high-explosive rounds could sweep the entire approach route clean. "Rodriguez, can you see movement in that oak grove?" Murphy pointed toward a cluster of bare trees where he'd spotted muzzle flashes during the earlier firefight. "Yeah, Sarge. Looks like at least a squad setting up a machine gun. Maybe more behind the ridge." Murphy felt the weight of decision settling on his shoulders like the January cold. Every option carried a price that would be paid in American lives. Fall back to the secondary line, and the Germans would control the crossroads by nightfall, cutting off 2 companies of the 3rd Infantry Division from their supply routes. Stay in position with their current firepower, and they'd all be dead or captured before noon. But the tank destroyer's main gun offered a 3rd possibility, one that required someone to cross 30 yards of open ground under enemy observation and climb into a vehicle that might explode at any moment. The resistance fighter's map crinkled in his pocket as he shifted position, reminding him how crude sketches and desperate improvisation had already saved their lives once. Sometimes the most unlikely tools made the difference between mission success and catastrophe. Sometimes a burning tank destroyer wasn't just a liability, it was an opportunity disguised as certain death. "Henderson, keep trying to raise battalion," Murphy said quietly. "Tell them we're still holding the crossroads, but we need support within the hour." He didn't mention the plan forming in his mind, the calculation of angles and ammunition that might turn their desperate situation into something resembling victory. That conversation would come later, after he'd studied the enemy positions more carefully and figured out whether courage or madness was driving his tactical thinking. The flames from the tank destroyer danced higher, casting orange shadows across the snow-covered ground, and the faces of men who trusted him to find a way out of the impossible. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation. And stay with us for the next chapters. The German probing attack came 20 minutes later, just as Murphy had expected. 3 squads of Wehrmacht infantry moved through the oak grove with textbook precision, using the terrain and tree cover to mask their approach until they were within grenade range of the American positions. Murphy watched them through a gap in the stone wall, counting weapons and estimating their probable assault route toward the crossroads. "They're testing our strength," he whispered to Kowalski, who had taken William's position behind an overturned supply cart. "Next time they'll come with everything they've got." The brief firefight lasted less than 2 minutes. German rifle fire cracked through the winter air, while Murphy's squad returned measured shots from their concealed positions. The enemy withdrew after taking what appeared to be light casualties, but Murphy knew they'd accomplished their real objective, confirming that the crossroads was held by a skeleton force with limited ammunition. The next attack would include armor support and probably twice as many infantry. Private Rodriguez crawled over from his position near the road, dragging the Browning automatic rifle and its remaining ammunition. His face was pale with cold and exhaustion, but his eyes held the steady focus of a soldier who'd learned to function despite fear. "Sarge, I counted at least 2 machine gun teams setting up on that ridge," he reported. "And I think I heard tank engines warming up behind the tree line. Sounds like Panzer IVs, maybe a company's worth." Murphy nodded, filing the tactical intelligence away while his mind continued working through the mathematics of their situation. 8 men with limited ammunition couldn't stop a company-strength attack supported by armor. The official doctrine called for immediate withdrawal to prepared defensive positions, but doctrine assumed they had a clear route of retreat. The forest road behind them was under German observation, and any movement would draw artillery fire that could scatter his squad across miles of hostile territory. Henderson looked up from the radio with frustration written across his features. "Still nothing from battalion, Sarge. I'm getting some traffic from other units, but it's all broken up. Sounds like the whole sector's taking pressure." That news didn't surprise Murphy, but it confirmed his growing suspicion that no relief was coming anytime soon. The 3rd Infantry Division was stretched thin across too many miles of mountainous terrain, with German counterattacks probing every weak point in their lines. His squad was effectively on its own until the tactical situation stabilized, which might be hours or days, depending on how the larger battle developed. The tank destroyer continued burning, its metal hull popping and crackling as the flames consumed rubber seals and electrical components. But the main gun remained untouched, pointing like an accusing finger toward the enemy positions. Murphy studied the vehicle's position relative to the stone wall, calculating angles of fire and the time it would take to cross the open ground. 30 yards had never looked so far. "What are you thinking, Sarge?" Kowalski asked, following his gaze toward the burning vehicle. Murphy didn't answer immediately. The plan, taking shape in his mind, violated every principle of small unit tactics he'd learned in training. It required exposing himself to concentrated enemy fire while attempting to operate unfamiliar equipment under combat conditions. The odds of success were marginal at best, and the consequences of failure would leave his remaining men without leadership, when the main German attack began. But the alternative was watching his squad get overrun by superior numbers, knowing that their deaths would accomplish nothing except opening a gap in American lines that might cost hundreds more lives. The resistance fighter's crude map had taught him that desperate situations sometimes required equally desperate solutions. Sometimes survival meant choosing the option that looked most like suicide. "Rodriguez, can you give me suppressing fire on that oak grove for about 30 seconds?" he asked quietly. The bar gunner's eyes widened as he realized what Murphy was considering. "Sarge, that's a long way to run with Jerry watching every step. And even if you make it to the TD, there's no guarantee that gun will function after what it's been through. How many HE rounds did you count beside the gunner's position?" "Maybe a dozen. Could be more stacked in the ready rack." Murphy did the tactical mathematics in his head. 12 high-explosive rounds, properly placed, could sweep the entire German assembly area clean and buy enough time for his squad to withdraw to secondary positions. The main gun had been designed to engage enemy armor at ranges up to 1,000 yards. Against infantry in the open, it would be devastatingly effective. If he could reach the vehicle, if the firing controls still functioned, if the ammunition hadn't been damaged by heat from the fire. Too many variables, too many ways for the plan to collapse into catastrophe. But every alternative led to the same conclusion. His men would be dead or captured within the hour, and the crossroads would fall to German control. Sometimes leadership meant accepting impossible odds because the alternative was accepting certain failure. The sound of armored vehicles grew closer, accompanied by the rhythmic crunch of boots on frozen ground that indicated large numbers of infantry moving into assault positions. Murphy estimated 15 minutes before the German attack began in earnest. 15 minutes to cross 30 yards of open ground, master unfamiliar equipment, and turn a burning vehicle into an effective weapons platform. He checked his rifle one final time, ensuring the safety was off and a round was chambered. The tank destroyer's flames seemed to beckon through the winter air, promising either salvation or a particularly dramatic way to die. Captain Morrison's voice crackled through Henderson's radio handset, distorted by static but recognizably urgent. The battalion commander was calling for status reports from all forward positions as German pressure mounted across the entire Vosges Mountains sector. Murphy took the handset and pressed it close to his ear, trying to filter meaning from the broken transmission. "Under attack. Secondary line. Hold until artillery support." Murphy could only catch fragments of the message, but the tone conveyed everything he needed to know. The 3rd Infantry Division was fighting for its life across multiple fronts, and no help was coming to his isolated squad. "Badger 6, this is Badger 3-7, Murphy replied, using his unit's call sign. "Crossroads secure but under pressure. Enemy armor and infantry massing for assault. Request immediate artillery on grid." He paused, trying to remember the map coordinates from the morning briefing. Static consumed Morrison's response, leaving Murphy with the uncomfortable certainty that they were truly on their own. He handed the radio back to Henderson and returned his attention to the tactical problem confronting them. The German attack would begin soon. He could feel it in the way the forest had gone quiet, the way shadows moved differently among the trees where enemy infantry waited for their signal. Private Martinez crawled over from his position covering the southern approach, his face grim with the kind of news that never improved a desperate situation. "Sarge, I think I spotted German observers on Hill 304. If they've got that high ground, they can see our whole position and probably call in mortar fire." Murphy absorbed this information while studying the tank destroyer through a gap in the stone wall. The vehicle's fire had died down somewhat, but smoke still poured from the engine compartment in thick black columns that would be visible for miles. Every German unit in the sector knew exactly where the American position was located. Concealment and surprise were no longer tactical options. "How's your ammunition holding up?" he asked Martinez. "Down to maybe 20 rounds. Same for most of the guys. We might get off one good volley when they come, but after that... The sentence didn't need completion. Murphy had fought enough actions in the snow-choked forests of eastern France to know how quickly small units could be overwhelmed by superior numbers. The Wehrmacht had learned hard lessons about American firepower during 2 years of retreat, and their tactics had evolved to exploit exactly the kind of situation his squad now faced. Rodriguez shifted position behind the overturned cart. His bar trained on the oak grove, where German machine gun teams had been setting up their weapons. "Sarge, I keep thinking about that gun on the TD. Even if the fire control systems are damaged, a man could probably operate it manually, line up targets by eye, fire individual rounds at clusters of infantry." The idea had been nagging at Murphy's tactical instincts for the past hour, growing stronger each time he calculated their diminishing chances of survival. The tank destroyer's main gun represented firepower equivalent to a full artillery battery. If someone could reach the vehicle and operate its weapon systems under combat conditions. The distance from their position to the burning tank destroyer might as well have been measured in light years, given the German sniper positions commanding the open ground. But impossible missions had become Murphy's specialty during 2 years of combat across Sicily, Italy, and now France. He'd learned that survival often required choosing the option that looked most like suicide, betting his life on split-second timing and the enemy's tendency to hesitate when confronted with actions that defied military logic. "Henderson, can you see any movement around that machine gun position in the oak grove?" The radio operator studied the tree line through a pair of battered binoculars, scanning methodically for muzzle flashes or the telltale glint of optical equipment. "Looks like they're settling in for a coordinated assault. I count at least 2 MG-42s, probably more infantry behind the ridge where we can't see them." Murphy felt the familiar tightness in his chest that preceded moments of absolute decision. Every instinct developed through months of frontline combat warned him that conventional tactics would fail here. His squad lacked the ammunition and firepower to stop a determined German attack, and withdrawal would expose them to concentrated fire while crossing open ground. But the tank destroyer offered a third option, one that required accepting almost certain death in exchange for a slim chance of tactical success. The resistance fighters' crude map had saved their lives by showing routes that more sophisticated intelligence had missed. Sometimes the most desperate solutions were also the most effective, precisely because they lay outside the enemy's tactical expectations. Sometimes a burning vehicle wasn't an obstacle to be avoided, but a weapon waiting to be claimed by someone willing to pay its price. "Rodriguez, when I give the signal, I want concentrated fire on that oak grove for exactly 30 seconds, he said quietly. "Don't try to conserve ammunition. Make them keep their heads down." Understanding dawned in the bar gunner's eyes, followed immediately by the kind of professional objection that good soldiers were trained to voice. "Sarge, that's suicide. Even if you make it to the TD, you'll be exposed on that gun mount, with every sniper in the sector drawing a bead on you." Murphy checked his rifle one final time, ensuring the action was clear and his spare ammunition was easily accessible. The calculation was simple. 8 men with limited firepower couldn't hold the crossroads against company-strength attacks supported by armor. But 1 man with a tank destroyer's main gun might be able to break up the German assault long enough for the survivors to withdraw to secondary positions. The mathematics of sacrifice had become brutally clear during months of combat in the Vosges Mountains. Sometimes leadership meant accepting impossible odds, because the alternative was watching good men die for nothing. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. The German assault began with a barrage of mortar rounds that shattered the winter silence and sent fragments of stone and frozen earth cascading over Murphy's position. He pressed himself against the wall as explosions walked across the crossroads in a methodical pattern designed to suppress any American resistance before the infantry attack began. Through the smoke and debris, he could see muzzle flashes erupting from multiple positions in the oak grove as machine gun teams opened fire in support of their advancing comrades. "Now! Rodriguez!" he shouted over the din of incoming fire. The bar gunner rose from behind the overturned cart and began laying down suppressing fire in controlled bursts, his weapon chattering in the distinctive rhythm that experienced soldiers learned to distinguish from the German MG-42s. Martinez and Henderson joined in with their M1 rifles, creating a thin curtain of American fire that forced the enemy infantry to move more cautiously through the trees. Murphy sprinted toward the burning tank destroyer, his boots slipping on snow made treacherous by a thin layer of ice. 30 yards had never felt so far. German rifle bullets cracked past his head, while machine gun rounds stitched patterns in the frozen ground behind his running feet. The vehicle grew larger with each stride, its twisted turret and blackened hull resolving into mechanical details that might mean the difference between life and death. A sniper's bullet tugged at his sleeve as he dove behind the tank destroyer's rear hull, using its bulk to shield himself from the concentrated fire now directed at his position. The metal was hot to the touch, despite the January cold, radiating heat from the internal fire that had consumed the engine compartment. But the main gun remained intact, its barrel elevated at precisely the angle needed to sweep the oak grove, where German infantry continued their advance. Murphy scrambled up onto the vehicle's deck, ignoring the rifle fire that sparked against the armored hull around him. The gunner's position was cramped and unfamiliar, with controls and optical equipment arranged according to tank destroyer doctrine rather than the infantry weapons he'd mastered. But the basic principles were simple enough. Traverse the gun toward the target, estimate range and deflection, and fire high explosive rounds into concentrations of enemy troops. The first shot was pure guesswork. Murphy aligned the gun by eye, aimed at the largest cluster of muzzle flashes in the oak grove, and pulled the firing lever. The weapon's recoil was tremendous, much stronger than anything he'd experienced with rifle or machine gun fire. The high explosive round detonated among the trees, with a flash that illuminated running figures and the scattered components of what had been a German machine gun position. Rifle fire intensified as enemy soldiers realized that the burning tank destroyer had become an active threat. Bullets rang against the gun shield, while Murphy fumbled with the loading mechanism, trying to chamber another round while German snipers adjusted their aim. The second shot took longer to prepare, but his target selection was more deliberate. A cluster of infantry moving through relatively open ground between tree clusters. The explosion scattered the German assault team and silenced at least one machine gun position, but Murphy could see more enemy soldiers moving to flank his exposed position. The tank destroyer offered some protection from frontal fire, but its sides and rear were vulnerable to infantry armed with Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons. He had perhaps 2 more minutes before German troops worked close enough to destroy the vehicle and everyone on it. The third and fourth shots came in quick succession, high explosive rounds that turned the oak grove into a chaos of splintered trees and scattered equipment. Murphy was beginning to understand the weapon's characteristics, its range, the way rounds behaved against different types of targets, the time required to traverse from one firing position to another. But understanding came at a cost, measured in near misses, that grew steadily more accurate as German marksmen adjusted to his position. Rodriguez's bar had gone silent, either from ammunition exhaustion or because its operator had been hit by the increasingly intense German fire. Murphy could hear his remaining squad members returning fire from their positions behind the stone wall, but their shots sounded scattered and desperate. The tank destroyer's main gun was breaking up the German assault, but slowly, too slowly to prevent enemy infantry from working close enough to finish the job with grenades or anti-tank weapons. A Panzerfaust round struck the vehicle's front slope with a metallic clang that rang through the hull like a bell. The projectile failed to penetrate, but its impact threw Murphy against the gun controls and reminded him that his tactical situation remained desperate. The main gun held perhaps 8 more rounds of high-explosive ammunition, enough to continue suppressing the German attack, but not enough to destroy every enemy position in the sector. He fired the 5th round at a machine gun nest that had been particularly troublesome, watching the explosion silence the weapon and scatter its crew. But even as that threat disappeared, he could see German infantry moving through the forest in a wide, enveloping movement, designed to attack the crossroads from multiple directions. His improvised artillery support was effective, but it couldn't be everywhere at once. The 6th shot targeted a cluster of infantry that had advanced to within 50 yards of the American positions. Murphy was learning to adjust his aim based on the explosion patterns, walking rounds into target areas with the methodical precision of an experienced gunner. But the enemy was learning too, adapting their tactics to minimize exposure to the tank destroyer's fire while continuing to press their assault. German voices echoed from the tree line, officers shouting orders that Murphy couldn't understand, but whose urgency was unmistakable. The attack was beginning to falter as unit cohesion broke down under the unexpected artillery fire from what should have been a disabled vehicle. Enemy soldiers were seeking cover rather than advancing, buying precious time for the American defenders to consolidate their position or withdraw to secondary lines. But time was still running out, measured in ammunition and the steady approach of German troops who had identified the tank destroyer as the key threat to their tactical success. The 7th round misfired, producing only a metallic click when Murphy pulled the firing lever. He frantically checked the loading mechanism while rifle bullets sparked off the gun shield around him, trying to clear what might be a defective shell or a mechanical malfunction in the weapon's firing system. German voices were growing closer, and he could hear the distinctive whine of Panzerfaust rockets being armed in nearby positions. For a moment that stretched like eternity, Murphy faced the possibility that his desperate gamble had failed at the crucial moment. The tank destroyer's main gun represented their only hope of breaking up the German assault, and mechanical failure would leave his squad defenseless against overwhelming odds. But as he worked the loading mechanism, muscle memory from countless hours of weapons training took over, guiding his hands through procedures he'd never actually practiced on this particular weapon. The firing pin had jammed, a common malfunction that could be cleared by manually cycling the action. Murphy forced the mechanism through its complete sequence, ejected the defective round, and loaded another high-explosive shell. The entire process took perhaps 30 seconds, but German rifle fire had grown so intense that he could barely raise his head above the gun shield to acquire targets. When the 8th round fired, its explosion silenced 2 machine gun positions simultaneously. Murphy was beginning to understand something that would never appear in any after-action report or medal citation. The real secret wasn't his marksmanship or tactical brilliance, but his willingness to remain on that burning vehicle long enough to learn its weapon systems under combat conditions. Each shot had been an education, each near miss a lesson in deflection and range estimation. But the education was costing more than he'd expected to pay. Shrapnel from a nearby mortar round had opened a gash along his left arm, and German sniper fire was becoming increasingly accurate as enemy marksmen adjusted to his position. The tank destroyer's armor provided some protection, but Murphy was exposed each time he raised his head to acquire targets or adjust the gun's elevation. "Sarge!" Rodriguez's voice carried across the battlefield from his position behind the overturned cart. German infantry moving up the south slope, maybe a full squad. Murphy traversed the gun toward the new threat, but the mechanical controls responded slowly to his unfamiliar manipulation. The 9th round caught the German flanking movement in the open, scattering the infantry and buying more time for his defensive position. but he was down to 3 rounds of high explosive ammunition, and enemy soldiers continued to probe for weaknesses in multiple directions. The real secret, the truth that would never make it into official reports, was that Murphy had been terrified from the moment he'd climbed onto the tank destroyer. Every instinct screamed at him to abandon the exposed position and seek cover with his squad behind the stone wall. The vehicle's deck offered no protection against plunging fire, and German artillery observers had certainly called in strikes on his position by now. But terror wasn't the same thing as panic, and months of combat in the Vosges Mountains had taught him to function despite fear. The tank destroyer's gun represented firepower that could save American lives, and that possibility was worth the risk of death or capture. Sometimes leadership meant accepting impossible odds because the alternative was watching good men die for preventable reasons. The 10th round targeted a German mortar team that had been walking their fire closer to American positions. Murphy's aim was improving with practice, and the explosion destroyed not only the weapon, but also a stack of ammunition that created secondary explosions throughout the enemy position. The blast seemed to break something in the German assault, turning their organized advance into individual decisions about whether continued attack was worth the cost. Henderson appeared beside the tank destroyer, running in a low crouch while machine gun fire kicked up snow around his boots. The radio operator had abandoned his equipment to carry ammunition from their original position, rifle rounds and grenades that might be needed if German infantry reached the crossroads, despite the artillery support. "Sarge, Captain Morrison's on the radio!" he shouted over the noise of nearby explosions. "Says relief is en route, maybe 30 minutes out. Just need to hold until then." 30 minutes might as well have been 30 hours, given Murphy's tactical situation. The tank destroyer held perhaps 2 more rounds of main gun ammunition, and German infantry had identified his position as the primary obstacle to their success. Enemy soldiers were moving to surround the vehicle from multiple directions, carrying Panzerfaust weapons and satchel charges that could destroy it regardless of its armor protection. The 11th round was his best shot of the engagement, a perfectly placed high-explosive shell that caught a German assault team in the open and scattered their equipment across 50 yards of forest floor. But even as that threat disappeared, Murphy could see enemy soldiers moving through the tree line in a coordinated envelopment designed to attack the crossroads from directions where the tank destroyer's gun couldn't traverse. He was down to 1 round, with German infantry closing from 3 sides, and no way to withdraw from his exposed position without abandoning the weapon that had kept his squad alive. The mathematics of the situation had become brutally simple. He could fire 1 more shot, then defend the tank destroyer with rifle and grenades until relief arrived or German troops overwhelmed his position. The final round would have to count. Murphy saved the last high-explosive round for the largest concentration of German infantry he could identify. A full squad that had assembled in the oak grove for what appeared to be a final coordinated assault on the American positions. He took extra time with the shot, carefully adjusting elevation and deflection to place the round precisely where it would do the most damage to enemy tactical coordination. The explosion was perfect, scattering the German assault team and silencing their supporting machine gun positions simultaneously. But even as the smoke cleared, Murphy could see individual enemy soldiers continuing to advance through the forest, moving as individuals rather than organized units, but still carrying weapons that could overwhelm his isolated position through sheer determination. He climbed down from the tank destroyer with his M1 rifle and the 3 grenades Henderson had brought from their original position. The vehicle had served its purpose, breaking up the German attack and buying precious time for relief forces to approach the crossroads. But its ammunition was exhausted, and continuing to occupy such an exposed position would be suicide without tactical justification. "Rodriguez, Martinez, fall back to secondary positions," Murphy shouted across the battlefield, using hand signals to coordinate his squad's withdrawal from the stone wall to a cluster of pine trees that offered better concealment from enemy observation. The next 20 minutes passed in a series of small firefights as German infantry probed the American positions with diminishing enthusiasm. Murphy's improvised artillery barrage had broken the back of their assault, turning what should have been a coordinated company attack into scattered squad actions that his remaining men could handle with rifle fire and careful positioning. When relief finally arrived in the form of 2 Sherman tanks and a platoon of infantry from Baker Company, the German forces had already begun withdrawing toward their original positions. The crossroads remained under American control, and the eastern flank of the 3rd Infantry Division's line held firm against the day's counterattacks. Captain Morrison appeared an hour later, riding in a jeep with the battalion intelligence officer and a field clerk whose job was recording after-action reports for higher headquarters. Murphy watched them survey the battlefield, noting the destroyed German equipment, the scattered enemy positions, and the tank destroyer that still smoldered at the crossroads center. "Outstanding work, Sergeant," Morrison said, pulling out a field notebook to record the day's events. 12 rounds of main gunfire against concentrated infantry positions. Estimate 20 to 30 enemy casualties, multiple weapons destroyed, assault completely disrupted. Textbook application of available firepower under adverse conditions. Murphy nodded and provided the tactical details Morrison needed for his report. Enemy strength, weapons observed, approximate casualties, and the timeline of the engagement. But he didn't mention the terror that had accompanied each decision, the mechanical failures that had nearly ended the defense before it began, or the way his hands had shaken while loading high explosive rounds under concentrated sniper fire. The official report would describe a successful defensive action in which American forces used available equipment to defeat a superior enemy force through superior tactics and marksmanship. Clean sentences that transformed chaos into doctrine, fear into courage, and desperate improvisation into tactical brilliance. The kind of language that looked good in headquarters briefings and medal citations. Rodriguez, Henderson, Martinez, Murphy called his surviving squad members together after Morrison departed. "Good work today, every one of you." They didn't discuss what had happened in detail, the way some units spent hours analyzing their combat experiences. Frontline soldiers learned to carry certain memories quietly, sharing them only in oblique references, and the kind of understanding that passed between men who'd survived impossible situations together. The tank destroyer would appear in their stories differently than it appeared in official reports, as a vehicle that had asked for a price none of them had wanted to pay. 3 weeks later, Murphy received orders transferring him to a new assignment with additional responsibilities and a promotion that reflected his growing reputation for tactical initiative under adverse conditions. The citation accompanying his medal mentioned the tank destroyer engagement in language that made it sound like standard military procedure rather than a desperate gamble that had somehow succeeded. But on winter nights, when diesel fumes and the smell of burning rubber drifted across base camps in the Vosges Mountains, Murphy sometimes found himself back on that vehicle's deck, feeling shrapnel ring against the gun shield while he tried to load one more round before German infantry reached his position. The official reports described what had happened. Only his memory carried the weight of how it had felt. Years after the war, when civilian friends asked about his combat experiences, Murphy learned to redirect the conversation towards safer topics. The tank destroyer had become part of his legend, transformed into clean narrative that emphasized courage and tactical skill while omitting the moments of pure terror that had accompanied each decision. People wanted to hear about heroes, not about young men who'd been too stubborn or too frightened to abandon impossible positions. The resistance fighter's crude map remained in his personal effects, folded and refolded until the pencil marks had faded to barely visible lines. Sometimes he studied it while trying to remember exactly how they'd reached the crossroads that morning, before the German attack had turned a routine defensive mission into something that would follow him for the rest of his life. The map looked like a child's drawing, but it had guided them home when more sophisticated tools failed, proving that survival sometimes depended on the most unlikely resources, including the willingness to climb onto a burning vehicle because 8 men's lives were worth more than 1 man's fear. If this story reminded you that behind every medal there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.